everybody. Welcome to a very strange episode of Lies. I am here today hanging out with Richard Cutland. Richard, do you want to talk about yourself and why we're doing this thing?
Do I want to talk about myself, James? Not really. Well, thank you. Firstly, thank you for inviting us to your marvellous show. I am Richard Cutland, Head of Military Relations for Europe. I won't bore you with all the detail. Obviously, Wargaming.net, hopefully the viewers are quite aware who we are by now. Me personally, I'm an ex-British Army tanker, so 30 years in the British Army, and I've been with Wargaming about 5 years now, so that's me.
And we just thought it was rad that we had an actual expert to talk to, and wanted to encourage more game companies to hire more people of that ilk. So we figured today we'd do sort of a pseudo-lies episode for the D-Day series. Before we begin, there is one actual glaring error that we made. I think back in episode 3, we labeled Brittany as Normandy, which it's not. But you know,
well,
but otherwise,
these things happen. These things happen.
So yeah, because we have you on, I would love to dive in and talk about all the cool toys and equipment that they had to make this thing possible, because this is a crazy expedition, right? The logistics of invading Europe is still mind-boggling. But since I want to talk about the cool toys, do you want to talk a little bit about ducks and Hobart's funnies? Because I thought those were incredible.
Yeah, sure. Like you said, James, it's just, the sheer logistics of this operation were quite incredible. Ducks, I love the name anyway. Obviously, it's just commonly referred to as ducks, DUKW, not duck as in duck. All we could say was with the need there, so by early 42, you had this need for these floating cars, really. Because of the planned invasion, the planned landing initially of the Allied forces in North Africa, of course, was not far off, and the machine was needed, really, that could be loaded with personnel and, of course, in necessary property and equipment as well. The chassis taken from an army truck, so quite simple, really, a GMC army truck. Which by the time, of course, was in absolutely huge mass production. So, absolutely thousands and thousands of them available. The company was a company called Marmon Harrington, which undertook the design of the layout of this amphibious car, and also did incredibly well with this task. Amphibious body, of course, created by another company known as Sparkman and Stephen, if my memory serves me correctly. And the body was a pontoon type made of around about 2 millimeters of steel and mounted on a spar frame. So not particularly strong as far as, armor protection are concerned, but very, very capable on what they did. And as a result, the GMC, the Duck, the initial one, the 353, was born. And production started around about spring 1942. What else do we really want to say about it? It was, if you've seen pictures of it, of course, it looks like a sort of tent could be pulled, like a tent frame was on the back of it. They had various different armaments, but most commonly installed on there was the Browning M2, this large caliber machine gun. And propeller on there was just a sort of normal 3-bray propeller in the tunnel of the body. Self-pulling winch as well, and also some water pumping equipment, which unfortunately in this particular operation came into play quite a lot. Not particularly fast, maximum speed. Not bad for a boat. It was around about 80 kilometers per hour on land, because of course it was amphibious, and on water all the way down to about 10 kilometers. So sort of that was the Duck in general. An incredibly useful vehicle, obviously, and many would argue that without this particular vehicle, then the operation wouldn't have actually carried. Lots of administrative problems, logistic problems, obviously fueling the things as well, but a great vehicle.
Well, and what fascinated me, besides the fact that so many of them are still in use, I'm over in Seattle, Washington, and the Seafarer Pirates ride around in one all summer long. But what was fascinating to me is that these were used not only for the original landing, but to support the operation all the way through, to help move from the large ships to the shore a lot of this equipment, right? And so I find these things, very, very interesting in the fact that it's that truck which becomes so essential for the Allies, but especially fit out for water and for beach operations, right? Because I know that they did all sorts of weird things to the tires to make them better to drive along that beach.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sort of goes back to, like you say, it's quite interesting that you say that. When I've been to the States, you see much more over there for some reason than you ever do in any other parts of Europe. So obviously a lot were left over anyway. But the sheer, I guess because it was a simple vehicle in terms of build, structure, maintenance and everything, it was so reliable. And without these, as I said before, you can argue that the operation really, it wouldn't have been as successful as it perhaps, particularly was at that stage. I mean, they had their transporting over 80,000 troops initially, which is a huge call for there. And the tyres, you say, well, I've seen some photos as well. They've actually used a variety of tyres. They had some that they would steal from the Germans or anything they could find. There's a great photo of one that's actually fitted with, they've managed to fit some sort of tractor tyres to it as well, because it had no spares left at that stage. So, a great vehicle, really, really good.
And I kind of want to take a right turn because I was thinking about it while you were saying it. And I wanted to explore because I've heard it said more than once that perhaps the most important vehicle to the Allies winning the war was that truck you were talking about, was this truck that we could get into mass production and haul things all around the globe in. And so I just kind of wanted your thoughts on that sentiment, whether it's an exaggeration or completely false or fairly accurate.
I mean, I'd say I have to obviously think here. I always think with the Brit mentality, so I could argue that a lot of the British equipment was the best. But no, I totally agree with you, James. It was. I mean, you can argue perhaps the Jeep, the traditional Jeep, was just as important as obviously just as utilised. But yeah, no, I think it's a very fair comment to say that without these trucks, things wouldn't have been quite what they were. Even though I hate to admit it.
Let's move back from the humble truck to the over-the-top Hobart's funnies. Because when looking at pictures of this and when reading about the equipment they landed with, some of those were fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Hobart's funnies, it's always something that anybody sort of historically wise, I mean, you're talking about it, and for some reason anybody says Hobart's funny, you instantly think, obviously, English, eccentric, crazy people that we are. And it was sort of their ability, I think, to be quite ingenious. The special tanks that really was what it was all about. So the nickname Hobart's Funnies came after General Percy Hobart. It was quite a character itself, and he was commander of the 79th Armoured Division. And in March 43, he was given this task of working out the possibility of providing armoured support, for the landings off of the coast. As well as equally as important, really, the breakthrough afterwards. So this breakthrough through these these fortifications, through the minefields, everything else that, of course, the Germans could throw against them there. So it was his task to come up with some ingenious, not crazy, because we are, maybe a little bit crazy, but quite eccentric. So he came and put various ideas forward to do that. The idea of floating tanks really was something which he was, quite ingenious about. Now, obviously, the idea of floating a tank is initially seems completely crazy. I've had all main battle tanks nowadays have the ability to do deep wading. Of course, with snorkels, you have the ability to go quite deep in the. I've only ever done it once in 30 years in the British Army, actually gone through water in a tank. And I'll tell you, for any tank crew, it is a terrible experience, especially for the driver who may be submerged. You're relying on fantastic seals for the vehicles, etc., etc. But anyway, he came up with these, and these initial idea of this floating tanks was what we had with the duplex drive. That's the sort of DD, the duplex drive. That's where the acronym DD is quite commonly referred to as these sort of amphibious vehicles there. Obviously, the worst problems were with the engine, obviously flooding, air inlets, etc., etc. So you've seen there with the huge canvas that he designed to go on the outside of the vehicles. Actually, not so long ago, we were down at Bovington looking at one of the actual vehicles that was involved in these operations. And I have to say, when you look at it from the outside and you look at this canvas and you think that these guys were actually, going to be under sustained fire coming in there, it's incredibly brave. And I have to say, an ingenious, from a technical point of view, it was an ingenious idea, an ingenious construction. Of course, when it got onto land, it was quite a long process for them to drop down this frame as well. So the initial frame would have to be dropped down again. Not great if you're considering they were under fire, etc., to turn it into an ordinary combat vehicle. So that was one of his, which is very well known, the sort of DD crab, as it was known. There was also the crocodile, of course. The crocodile, a Churchill tank that was modified with this flamethrower on it as well.
And this is what I wanted to talk about, because this one has always struck me as madness, because they haul the flamethrower fuel behind them, right?
Yeah, you had an armoured trailer on the back. I mean, it literally is a trailer hooked to the back of it. And in there, they had around about 400 gallons. That's what, sort of 1,800 litres of fuel on there. Yeah.
I would feel pretty nervous in a tank hauling like that much explosive behind me. And I mean, I know it was armored, but still.
Yeah, if you do read the anecdotes of some of the crews that crew these Churchill crocodiles, the sentiment, of course, was exactly the same with them. The idea of rolling fuel. And don't forget, of course, we're talking mine strikes. We're talking, not just fire as well. So, yeah, it was, incredibly. I think it had to be an incredibly brave man, shall we say, to actually roll in one of these Churchill crocodiles. But they were quite effective. They were effective, and of course, we're going back to this, this flamethrower idea. Which, to be honest, I mean, even then, the idea of using flamethrowers in a conflict was, it wasn't a nice weapon. I know there's no such thing as a nice weapon, but perhaps this, out of all of them, was the one that was viewed as the least humane, shall we say, for want of a much better word.
Well, I mean, I think that's fair. I think that we have seen throughout the conflicts of the late 20th century just how horrific that weapon can be. It was funny, years ago when working at Activision, I had a conversation about whether or not Call of Duty was about burning a man alive from that distance, because for the things we want to represent, we definitely need to acknowledge that is part of this conflict, but is that something we want to glorify in our films and our television, or is that something that we hopefully can move away from in conflict?
Interesting you say that. Obviously, for me, one of the questions, we're totally digressing here, aren't we? But it's a very interesting conversation. When I sort of first joined a gaming company, one of the major questions that still crops up with is, my personal opinion for this whole adage of gaming and conflict and so on. I mean, obviously, the war is not a game. That's very, very straightforward, a very simple thing to say. So very interesting conversations. But I think this, you can see the strength of the gaming industry now is obviously your own company shows, but the promotion of the history, something I'm very passionate about, is that it's something I've always been a big fan that you can learn from history, and if we don't learn from it, then mistakes are going to be made again. So I think that the gaming industry plays such an important role in this now. And again, of course, yes, I hate to mention the name of the game, obviously, that you mentioned previously, but there are certain games which sort of are pushing the boundary, shall we say, to the extreme.
And on the other hand, I don't know if you got to see Battlefield 1, which just recently came out.
Sure.
I loved the introduction there, because I thought it was one of those really powerful things where they have the soldiers running in trench warfare, right, in that sort of suicide charge. And you're not expected to win. But every time you die, every time you lose, it tells you the name of that character and then like the age, right? How long they live, just like them. And then you immediately pop into another one. And as you're getting people, it really hammers home that these are human beings, right?
Yep,
like that in these conflicts. Because very often when we talk about history, we also run into that problem of thinking of it abstractly, right? Not thinking of this as the human beings who are going through all of these events, right? The terror of floating in one of those tanks, to hoping your tank doesn't sink or your little canvas sheet doesn't get torn up by machine gun fire before you hit that beach.
It's incredibly poignant, and I'm like you say, I'm a huge fan. We love, all of us that are tank nuts or tank nerds or whatever you want to call us. We love the engineering and we love the sort of historical part of it, but a big, huge believer that the history behind the chaps that worked in them. I mean, any tank is only as good as its crew to this day. So, these guys, in my time in the army, of course, yes, I've been on a few operational tours, but nothing that would ever compare with, and I don't think any of us have this appreciation of what these guys must have gone through, and on all sides. I mean, we're not just obviously talking about allies, but everybody who's serving in these metal boxes. It must have been incredibly terrifying.
I mean, to be honest, we're writing these. I was even thinking about what it must have been like, because I mean, most of the German guys up in those pillboxes, I mean, a lot of them were pretty raw recruits, were people who had been sort of conscripted after Germany had milled through most of its more qualified manpower.
Yeah.
And
experienced troops,
yeah, and I mean, a lot of them were young, and I just imagine waking up and seeing all those ships on the horizon, and those guns start to fire, and realizing what was happening. And I mean, all these things are these incredibly powerful, incredibly terrifying moments in the second that you sort of draw yourself into what it must have been like to have been there, right? But since we're talking about the engineering and the sort of ingenuity, and about things that are positive or life-saving, real quick before we leave the Hobart's funnies and these specialized tanks, you want to talk about the mine flail tank? Because I always thought this thing was really cool.
Yeah, again, Bombington have got a great example. The Bombington Tank Museum have got a fantastic example of this. And you said, I mean, the whole idea since sort of day dot for mine extraction and mine clearance has been one of, I mean, even to this day with the modern army, it's all about saving lives. And again, when we talk about crewing these vehicles, because you imagine, so you have this huge vehicle, whatever, I mean, and the option to mount it on numerous different types of vehicles, but the idea of this flailing literally just in front of you and blowing up mines, again, it was a fantastic idea, but again, from the sheer practicalities and the sheer purpose of it. But it did, I mean, it served its purpose. It worked well. If you look at some of the examples around the globe, you can see that the strength of some of these mines, where if you have a look at these sort of claws, these flails on there, I mean, they are absolutely massive, and some of them have been completely blown off, and some of them have huge chunks out. So, I mean, it's great. I mean, obviously, his whole operation was all about, it wasn't just about the initial landing. Of course, the initial landing was the crux of this operation. Without this initial landing, it wouldn't have happened. But then, of course, trying to advance from there with the fortifications, with the bunkers. So, bless him for his ideas to come up with these, we say funnies. I mean, to some degree, I don't know why we call them funnies, because they are incredibly logical ideas. The DD tank, the mine flayers, it all makes perfect sense, really. And the crocodile, to some degree.
But since we were just talking about getting off the beach, there's a couple other things I want to talk about. I really wanted to talk about Pointe du Hoc, which I'm going to butcher every time I say it, because that was one of the things I couldn't get in the episode. But I really wanted to, because it's this incredible operation with this sort of ridiculous end to it. So do you want to talk about that at all?
Well, if you say, I mean, say you want to keep things brief, I know I was very lucky. I actually a couple of years ago, I mean, we could obviously talk about Pointe du Hoc for a day.
I could have done an entire episode on it.
I was very, very lucky, and I think that a couple of years ago, I actually we were doing it was a charity event with the cast from Band of Brothers.
Nice.
It was fantastic. I mean, it was fantastic because, of course, it was great to meet the cast. But even better was we actually met some of the people who were actually there, some of the veterans and some of the people that were there. And we had the opportunity while we were there to actually go out on a boat and look up at the cliffs. Now, I'd seen it a couple of times before from the defensive perspective, so looking down across the cliffs. But I have to say, once you get out in a boat, looking from the sea back up to those incredible cliffs, I mean, you do have to say, I mean, I think when you get there, again, we're going back to the personal side of it. When you look up there and you think these guys, and for some of them, we spoke to some of the veterans there, this is the first time that they'd ever been out of the USA. So some of the veterans there, the first thing they have to do is land off this ship and then scale these, what looks like almost impenetrable cliffs. So again, I wish I'd made a video or something when you see it there, but because the perspective from the landing is so different from the other side.
Well, and for anybody who doesn't know, it's total madness in some ways, because what it is this like Ranger division has to go, and there's this artillery emplacement which is going to threaten the whole landing and going to be able to rain down fire on the beach. And these guys have to go and scale these cliffs. And I mean, we talk about charging out towards an entrenched position up a hill as madness, as suicide. This is just a vertical cliff, right?
Yeah,
and these guys are literally they're just literally climbing the thing.
And don't forget that you utilised as well. You had the Rangers, of course. 3 companies of Rangers on the initial in the first wave. So you had, what was it, D, E, and F, the 2nd Battalion from the Rangers on that first wave as well. So these were the guys that were, well, they were the ones that were making their first initial impact. So, I mean, for these chaps, they're just scaling ropes to get up these cliffs. Quite incredible, quite amazing, really.
Well, what's really amazing to me is, so they do it. They get to the top. And there are no guns there. The Germans haven't put the guns in yet. So then these guys go looking for the guns and find them like a half mile back or whatever and blow them up because they can. But then they're stuck because now they're on top of this cliff and everybody else is trying to get up off the beaches. So now they're stuck for like, I forget how long, but it's like more than a day or whatever.
Yeah, it was more, yeah.
And they're running out of ammunition, so they start using German weapons. And actually, when relief comes, this is terrible for them because the relief comes in, and some of the German weapons made like very distinct sounds, very different than the American guns. And so they actually got fired on by some of the Allied troops as the relief was coming in, because they heard them like popping off shots, and it sounded like it was a German division or whatever. And so this whole thing is just such madness to me, but at the same time, this truly epic and heroic, like, yeah, we're just gonna go straight up a cliff, take out an entrenched position, and make sure nobody else gets bombarded while we do this. So I wish we had time to tell that story.
Absolutely. And I say the adage they use is organised chaos for those sort of, a couple of days there. But as you say, and I think again, talking from the personal thing, we won't go through them all there. But there are so many stories from that particular scaling of the cliffs to the beach landings of personal heroism from incredible people. So it's there are some amazing books and features out there talking about these guys that did this. And I said I feel very honoured that I actually met a couple of them in person, and such nicer people you would never meet in your life. And so sort of we did the job because we had to do the job. I think that was, I will always recall that one of these gentlemen, I wish I could remember his name, talked to an audience. We were doing lots of press there, talked to an audience of quite young people, sort of teenagers and he was saying that everybody called him a hero, and he didn't like to be called a hero. He says, I wasn't a hero. And we were all like, well, you did this, you did remarkable things, from somebody who's ex-military as well. I appreciate it immensely. And he said, no. He says, we did it because we had to do it. And that was his answer to everything. He says, I have no doubt at all that, the people of today's generation would, if necessary, God help us, come forward and do exactly the same thing if needs be. But he was such an amazing guy.
That's really good. I'm really glad that you got to meet them. I'm really glad that you can relay those stories, and because we're losing so much of that, right? As this passes out of living memory. And so I'm glad that we even can just do this and you can share that moment. But I wanted to make
anyway,
sure...
sorry, James, we're digressing massively.
I would love to. I could do this forever. But I want to make sure to talk about the Enigma as well, and some of the Polish involvement, because we had to shorthand a little bit. I mean, it was one episode, 1 7-minute thing on the interwebs. So do you want to talk at all a little bit about the sort of cracking of the Enigma, both on the Polish and on the British side?
Yeah, I think, to be fair, out of the episodes, I think that's probably the one that we received most comment about, the fact that we didn't mention the Polish. But as you appreciate, and as you've said, James, then there's only so much time to bring it in there. So, we had that. So, the end of 1927, or the beginning of 28, really, we had this parcel accidentally brought to this Warsaw customs house. And it was an accident, which apparently, according to the declaration, said something like radio equipment on there. We had this representative of a German firm very insistently demanding that the parcel was returned to Germany. So we had all these sort of nice little stories that come out there. But it's around about July 15th, 1928, German military radio stations began broadcasting messages processed by this first encryption machine. And it was at this stage that the Polish monitoring stations, I think it's important to mention them there, began to intercept them, and all their cryptologists, their experts there from the intelligence department were instructed to read and sort of, try and work on and decrypt these messages. So, the importance there from the Polish was absolutely massive. We also had the French, of course, involved in an agent from the French military intelligence, under the command of what's his German code name, something like Rex Rudolf or Stallman. That was it, Rex Rudolf Stallman, received the German documents. And all of these cryptologists, all these experts working on all this there. Of course, it was at that stage as well, we had this Polish Cipher Bureau, which instructed the AVA radio to develop these sort of twins of the Enigma under all these instructions. So, the actual work there by, a lot of people, the French, the English, the Americans, all these specialists working on there. But it really was, quite rightly, I think, as our audience pointed out, the Polish specialists and their cryptologists, that the initial sort of like ones that began to think about this process and began to decrypt it. So again, I do apologise to our Polish community for perhaps not bringing it up as much as we should have there.
But it is fair. I mean, after that decryption, the German forces increased the number of wheels and sort of changed the Enigma machine enough that that initial decryption was no longer functional, and we had to have Bletchley Park and all that go back through and solve this thing, sort of building off that initial Polish research and Polish decryption effort. We could do a whole series on that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All these things would make. There's so many great stories, so many stories worth the telling too.
Yeah, and don't forget, of course, Polish were also the ones that gave, they gave each country this reconstructed model or copy of the Enigma. So it was, they were incredible with doing all that there. But of course, they had their own problems. The invasion of Poland, things became, like you said, we had then Bletchley Park play a huge part of it as well. So it was really a mass help by everybody. Everybody came to the forefront to try and do this. And there are, of course, some amazing movies out about Bletchley Park and all this, the Enigma machine. So, as I said, again, apologies to our Polish friends for perhaps missing them so dramatically from the story. But again,
maybe someday we'll do the invasion of Poland. No promises, but I think that's another story that's really worth the telling, and there's a lot of confusion about that. I mean, I would love to get so many stories, so much.
I have to say, you guys are so, I would say at this point, mass credit to your script writers, etc. The information you get there. We know how hard it is to try and get a very fair storytelling of factual information across in a very short space of time. And I think you guys do such an incredible job on it. So, really want to congratulate you on that. Maybe you're not you personally. I don't know how personal you are involved, but maybe your script writers or.
I write most of them. For this one, though, luckily, we had this really neat idea where everybody would sort of write one script for one of the various countries, and we had at least some people who had some connections to those countries, so it was a personal thing to come in and write the script for each of the nations involved. But yeah, usually I write the majority of them. Soraya also writes a number of them. And then periodically on things like this, when we think, a bunch of different voices would be valuable, we bring in some other folk. But another thing I wanted to talk about, because I feel like this is the most undersung thing of all of D-Day, but I find the Mulberries to be sort of mind-bogglingly incredible. This idea that they could just sort of float whole harbors, whole temporary harbors over from England and set up on a beach that totally wasn't built for it, something that could support the Allied effort as, I think, the only harbor they had for months.
Yeah. So the artificial harbour, the Mulberry. of course, it was, all the forces involved in Operation Overlord. Everything there was all about beaches. Everything there was about water. Everything. There was a need there for these artificial harbours. And again, British engineers, I have to say, hurrah, of course, developed this, and they built these two unique structures. They really, these huge structures represented a whole system of, breakwaters, piers and roads, really. It was this great idea that they had. And they were developed in incredible secrecy. Since 1943, they were looking at the ideas of this and building this up in secrecy. And in total, they sort of consisted of more than 200 of these huge concrete sort of like blockades and parts of this to make up this, this artificial harbour. And the idea, of course, it's all very well building an artificial harbour, but you have to have the ability to move it somewhere. So the ability for it to be towed, for the ability for it to be transported without a massive, it was a huge logistical task anyway. Had to be there. And of course you could, why were they needed in the first place? Well, we already mentioned perhaps the landings in Dieppe and this sort of thing as well. So it shows that we needed something where, it was all very well seizing a well-protected, already infrastructured port, but that always wasn't the case. That always wasn't, tactically viable or possible. So we had to have something to avoid unnecessary casualties. And all the things about all these operations are, there are going to be casualties. There are going to be vast amounts of casualties. There's some of the historical operations that have shown, but the idea from the upper echelon to the command is to minimize these casualties. So, going back to Hobart's funnies, this is perhaps, you could argue, sort of part of that as well, these artificial harbors as well. So, June the 6th, the day of the landing, tugboats pulled this sort of like huge things under heavy fire, set it all up there, and everything was ready to go. And the first harbor, not very perhaps aptly named, they called it Mulberry A, which I thought was great. So there was obviously a lot of thought that actually went into naming it on there. Was the unluckiest one. There was a lot of storms as they were transporting it, and they had huge amounts of problems with it. So, and again, it was, hats off to people like Dwight Eisenhower for being involved in this sort of thing as well. The construction of these was, it was a daring thing to try. It was a daring escapade as well. But again, it's all about reduction of casualties on our side.
Well, and just supporting the continuing operations, because as you said, we learned with Dieppe that how difficult it was to actually seize a harbor, right? And so my understanding is that over the next 4 or 5 months, these things were in continuous use. While supporting this effort, there was something like 2.5 million men were brought in on these Mulberries, and 4 million tons of supplies and hundreds of thousands of vehicles on these things that they floated over from England.
Yeah, logistics. Every conflict's all about logistics.
Right.
And even sort of going to, if you talk about, I don't know, more recent conflicts such as Iraq, Afghanistan, it needs logistics to do that. And the Mulberries played a huge part of that. You have to consider that each one was about a mile long. Yeah. And, without them, again, there are many things that we say without them, you could argue the operation wouldn't have been,
right.
Wouldn't have been what it was. But again, only history would tell. So like you say there, amazing creation.
And it's been a blast getting to talk, because I would love to even talk more tanks, but it's been kind of neat talking about things without a gun strapped to them that are so essential, because that stuff doesn't get talked about as much in these conflicts, and yet is just as important, if not more important, than some of the innovations in destructive technology.
Yeah, you're quite right, James. We always forget about these parts of, say logistics, and without this, without the Mulberry, without all this help that they have, then a soldier is only as good as the logistics chain, and they need this equipment. They need the ability to land. They need fuel. They need ammunition. They need water. They need rations and everything else. And again, without all these ideas and the reduction of casualties, without all these things, then it's all down to human life. And I guess if anything can save human life, then it's worth its weight in gold. Yeah. But I love the Mulberry. I love the idea of the Mulberry. It was incredible, absolutely incredible.
So on that note, we've actually already run super long. There's a million other things.
I was going to say so, yeah.
Yeah. And man, there's so many other things I would love to talk about, but I should just say thank you for your time and for your expertise and knowledge and all this stuff. And thanks to everybody at Wargaming for being willing and seeing the value in exploring the history and teaching the history alongside utilizing it for its entertainment value, which I think is an incredible thing.
Thanks, James. I mean, and likewise to you guys. You think you're the medium by which you promote history and the sort of fact telling of the story is absolutely incredible. And we are massive fans. And I may say all of my children are massive fans as well. So that moves me. That is fantastic to hear. Well, thank you again. Thanks everybody who made this possible. Thanks all the people who wrote and worked on the art and did everything to get this onto the internet. And for all you guys watching and for all the fans out there, thank you for demonstrating that, yeah, we still do care about history. And I will see you all next week.